This talk on Twisted Tales is one that I originally gave in October 2022 as part of the Reading Teacher series, which is a series of events for student teachers and those who teach student teachers. It's run in association with the UK Literacy Association and for universities in the UK and abroad. Anna Harrison from the University of Roehampton coordinates the group, and I'm grateful to Anna for having invited me to give the original version of this talk in October. During this talk, I'm going to make reference to Little Red Hood by Marie-Hélène Laurey. You don't have to have read it in order to hopefully enjoy the talk, but it will help you to contextualize what I'm saying. If you go on YouTube and look up Little Red Hood by Laurey, you will find recordings of people reading the book, or even better, get hold of a copy yourself. I can assure you, you won't regret it. The first thing I need to do is explain what I mean by twisted tales, and if you look on Wikipedia, then you will find a disambiguation page which lists different versions of twisted tales. So there's the Australian TV series, there's the Twisted Tales horror web series, there's Twisted Tales from the Horrible Histories team, and of course Disney's Twisted Tales, but I'm not going to be referring to any of those. I'm using the term twisted tales to refer to stories that we know that have been changed in some way that is significant. Now, I'm going to define that more in detail in a moment, but first of all, I want to talk about these if you like, competing terms of twisted tales or fractured fairy tales. Now, first of all, we've got a quote here from Jack Zipes from the Oxford Companion to Fairy Tales about the nature of fractured fairy tales. So he says that fractured fairy tales are traditional fairy tales rearranged to create new plots with fundamentally different meanings or messages. Fractured tales are closely related to fairy tale parodies, but the two serve different purposes. Parodies mock individual tales and the genre as a whole. Fractured fairy tales with a reforming intent seek to impart updated social and moral messages. Now, for me, I don't like the term fractured because it implies broken. And for me, when we change a story, whether it's a fairy tale or a folk tale, we are simply engaging with the natural processes of the oral tradition, which is to adapt and change stories to fit new circumstances and new societies. So that idea of twisting, for me, links with the twisting of threads, pulling together threads and twisting them to make new tales rather than breaking them. I'm also not so keen on the black and white dichotomy here that Zipes has created between fractured tales and parodies, and that parodies themselves can serve very, very serious purposes. And that to parody something is to actually question power often, and to question existing and established patterns. The idea of taking established folk or fairy tales and twisting them is well known in Hollywood, of course, and children will be quite used to seeing them on television or in the cinema. So if we start with Shrek, we have the twisting of the idea that the natural state of the princess is to be a beautiful human when actually she's a green ogre. In Enchanted, the setting of Cinderella is shifted to a contemporary city. In Tangled, the idea of the helpless female waiting in the tower for a man to rescue her is upended, so we can see here in the image how Rapunzel is quite a feisty young woman. In Hoodwinked, the motivations of the different characters are questioned. So a police inspector is introduced who is a frog, and he interviews the different characters, and we learn that Granny's life is far more exciting than Little Red Riding Hood ever thought. And going back to that idea of threads being twisted, in Into the Woods, Stephen Sondheim takes multiple tales and then twists those threads together to create a new yarn, a new tale out of it, where all of these stories are mixed together to create a brand new story. And he also questions the end of Happy Ever After. What happens after Happy Ever After? Is that really the end of the tale? So here is my definition of what I mean by a twisted tale. So it's a version of an established folk or fairy tale in which alternatives to the conventional elements of the narrative are presented in relation to either the setting, so we've got there the Cinderella in New York, representations of characters and their cultures, so we might see different faces we're not used to seeing in fairy tales, the motivations of characters, which goes back to Hoodwinked, the person whose story is told. So rather than looking at Cinderella, we might look at the stepsisters. The characters that are included, for example, the frog detective in Hoodwinked, power relationships between the characters, Rapunzel and the prince in Tangled, and the ordering of events, which I'll come on to later. And picking up again that idea of multiple threads forming a new yarn, a new tale, the story may also represent a combination of elements of more than one story. So I've mentioned Enchanted and the setting of a modern city, but we can see in children's books how the setting changes for particular fairy tales to create these twists, these new ways of seeing the story in a different place and perhaps in a different time. So in Jack and the Baked Beanstalk, we can see there, again, it's in a modern city. In Zombirella, Joseph Coelho has created a world in which zombies and vampires and monsters can exist, and so fairy tale characters get mixed in with the horror genre there. And the girl in red takes Little Red Riding Hood, and instead of her going into the dark forest, she goes into the dark inner city and meets the wolf wearing leathers there. Now, I've included Harry Potter here. Well, Harry Potter lives with the Dursleys under the stairs, does all the chores for the Dursleys. That's Cinderella, isn't it? And Jack Zipes has suggested that Harry Potter is just another adaptation of Cinderella and has written about this. Jack Zipes, by the way, is the foremost voice in English and German languages on Grimm's fairy tales. So here's our first reference to Little Red Hood by Marion Leray. And you say, well, what setting? How does space and time change here in this book? Well, look at that double-page spread there. We've got the wolf saying, "Dinner is served," and Little Red Riding Hood is on a surface, or being lifted from a surface that's delineated by two straight lines that are perpendicular to each other, but otherwise the page is empty. So I'm suggesting that this is a twisted tale simply from the perspective of alternative settings, alternative space, because it isn't defined for us. This could be in the forest. This could be in a city. It could be in a department store. We create our own world in which the wolf and Little Red Riding Hood exist because Leray has given us nothing here. So we're going to think about alternative representations of characters and their cultures. I'm going to start with different cultural versions of stories that we may recognise from a European perspective as Grimm's fairy tales or Perrault's fairy tales, etc. And before I go into looking at these individual ones that are on screen, I'm going to share a little bit of theory with you. And when I was teaching at Roehampton University, we used Green's 3D model of literacy as a way to explore the different aspects of reading, writing and spoken language with our students. Now, Green suggests that there are 3 dimensions to literacy, which is why it's 3D. The first is the operational dimension, which are the skills that you need in order to be able to read. So being able to decode and encode alphabetic print, being able to take sounds and join them together to make words in speech. The third element, which I'm going to treat next, is the critical model, which emphasizes the need to take critical engagement, to question representation, and to question power relationships within texts, how texts have been written to represent particular groups and particular interests. And then in the middle one, the cultural competencies, understanding literacy as a cultural practice means using our knowledge of the world in order to understand texts, both print and oral texts. That if I say to you the word tree, you may immediately imagine a tree that will be completely different to the one that I am imagining as I say the word tree, because that will depend on your own experience as a tree, what the last tree you saw was, whether you have particular favourite kinds of trees, etc., etc. So in terms of the cultural dimension, we're thinking about what are the experiences that young readers bring to a text. And then the critical dimension, what do they say about representation and power? So let's go back to these texts here. So up in the top left corner there, you've got Yeqian, which is the Chinese version of Cinderella. On the right, you can see the Egyptian version of Cinderella. And then if you look down and to the left, you've got Reisel's Riddle, which is a Jewish version of Cinderella. But if we think about the cultural dimension, what are young people bringing with them? So if they are bringing with them only the experience of having seen the Disney Cinderella or seen a Disney book of Cinderella, these are going to represent twists on that experience. Now we have to be careful here, of course, because Yeqian is not a twist on Cinderella. Yeqian is older than Cinderella. And in a sense, Cinderella is a twist on Yeqian, not the other way around. Similarly, the Egyptian Cinderella goes back 2,000 years. So it's when we talk about a cultural variation, that is a cultural variation to the one that you are used to. So a child, a learner with a Chinese heritage who perhaps has had the story of Yeqian shared with them in the home may find the European version a twist on what they know and what they expect to happen in a story. So here we have some cultural variations. As I said, Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters is a telling of a Zimbabwean story, and I know it as the Snake Chief rather than Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters, but the literary version created here is Mufaro's Beautiful Daughters. So that's an African version of Beauty and the Beast. And Sir Gawain and the Loathly Lady, again, is a twist on the idea of Beauty and the Beast, with the woman being the beast in this case. And it's a traditional English story, well, literary English story going back centuries. And then we have collections that are brought together for us, like Little Red Riding Hood stories from around the world, so different versions on Little Red Riding Hood. Does it always have to be a wolf in Little Red Riding Hood? Can it be a different animal? Is it always the Little Red Riding Hood of the grandmother, or are there different relationships in the story? And then the Oryx Multicultural Folktale series, I'm just going to put a word in for. They're not easy to get hold of because you can only get hold of them secondhand, but they really are useful sources of multiple cultural variations on fairy stories that we think we know really well. So here we have stories, rather than telling tales, say, from Egypt or China, actually stories that are well-known embedded versions of folk and fairy tales that have then been changed in some way, in the way that Jack Zipes talks about when he's referring to fractured fairy tales, to create different meanings. And the one that's front and centre there, you can see gender-swapped fairy tales. So the representations of character are completely switched. So the beast is female, and the protagonist in that story is male. Rather than Beauty, I think it's handsome or equivalent in that story. In Power to the Princess, we see the protagonists of the stories being women and having power. We're going to come on to the power part later on, but also there are multi-ethnic representations of women within that book. In Kate and the Beanstalk, rather than having a male Jack, we now have a female Kate. So it's an alternative version of the character. Now, the Little Mermaid in top right there is Jerry Pinkney's, and you can see he's got a Little Mermaid of colour. And immediately underneath that, you've got Nen and the Lonely Fisherman, which is not only a mermaid of colour, but also a same-gender relationship being built between the human and the merman in this case. But if you think that this is all very nice and very politically correct, but does it make any real difference? You need to look at some of the coverage of the Disney remake of The Little Mermaid, where the Little Mermaid is a mermaid of colour, to see the controversy around that and how some people have said it's impossible for the mermaid to be black because she's a white character. Well, I hate to break it to people, but mermaids possibly are not real anyway, and there is a well-established tradition of mermaids of colour. Not all mermaids are white. And as much as I want you to go away and read this Guardian article, I'd also invite you to go onto YouTube and find videos of families of colour and their children seeing The Little Mermaid of colour for the first time, and see the reactions of those children to think, actually, this doesn't matter. It really, really does matter that children can see themselves in texts, which is, again, it's the cultural domain, because we're thinking about what are the experiences of people, but also it's the critical domain, because we're thinking about where power lies and who is being represented. Who do I see when I open a book? Do I see myself? And for children of colour, seeing themselves in a fairy tale book opens that fairy tale world for them. For me, as a gay man, I'm opening Nen and the Lonely Fisherman and suddenly seeing, oh my goodness, there can be a same-sex relationship portrayed within a fairy tale. Let's look at alternative motivations for characters. This may not seem that dramatic, but actually, in relation to the genre of folk and fairy tale, it is, because folk and fairy tales traditionally are black and white. We do not explore the psychological motives of particular characters. The stories are action-driven. What happens with these versions is that the characters are unpicked. So we start to understand their internal lives more. So the true story of the Three Little Pigs, we understand the motivation of the wolf. With the worst princess, we understand her motivations to stand for herself, and the dragon actually isn't out to eat human beings in the way that we might think dragons are in relation to stories like George and the Dragon. And in Little Evie and the Wild Wood, the motivation of this version of Little Red Riding Hood of the wolf is a maternal motivation to care. So you can see how that dramatically changes how we understand these stories. Moving other characters to the centre and making us focus on those, because we have the story of Cinderella, and the clue is in the title. It's about the girl called Cinderella, but actually we could tell the story of the stepsisters, Cinderella's stepsisters, or we could tell the story of Prince Charming. Well, in this version, we have got Seriously, Cinderella is So Annoying. That is the story of the stepmother there. The story of the Three Little Pigs, the true story, that's the perspective of the wolf. And I love Minnie Gray's The Pea and the Princess, because that is told from the perspective of the pea. Coming back to that critical dimension and the idea of challenging power relationships, that can be done to great effect within twisting fairy tales, recasting fairy tales. So The Paper Bag Princess is a classic now, about the power relationship between men and women, that the princess is supposed to marry the prince, but he is a complete drip, so why should she? So she goes off and forms a friendship with the dragon. And we see here in Larrey's Little Red Hood, again, we have that reversal of power. Here, Little Red Riding Hood has tricked the wolf into taking poison, or possibly choking, we're not sure which. So here she takes power, going back to the earlier relationships, the earlier tellings of this story, where the girl took power rather than waiting for a man to sort out her problems. Underneath, I've put a frame from a wordless picture book version, a German publication by Kawamura. And you can see where the man is cutting open the wolf's stomach, and here we have Little Red Riding Hood and the grandmother looking very happy and not at all distressed to have been swimming in the gastric juices of a wolf. But they are definitely being helped there by a male. They're waiting for a male to help them. So what can we do when we're working with those traditional versions that actually we can twist? We can take responsibility ourselves as teachers to enable children to question the power relationships that they see within stories and their own cultural expectations. So this is a dialogue between me and a 4-year-old child at a storytelling workshop that I was doing at Leeds Beckett University for families. And we were using the Karamura text, and so you can see a page from that on the right of the screen. And the families were telling the story together, and then they had to retell the story, but work out how Little Red Riding Hood could save herself rather than waiting for a man. The 4-year-old had got bored and had left his group, and so I sat with him on the floor with the wordless picture book, and we talked together, and that's our conversations. That's our conversation. And you can see how I'm leading the conversation. I'm scaffolding it with him. I'm doing the I wonder questions there. I wonder where she found the scissors. Oh, they were in the wolf's stomach. Well, how did they get there? He swallowed them earlier. I wonder how Little Red Riding Hood found the scissors. And then he says she used the torch that her mother gave her. And he is finding solutions to problems. This is about problem solving. And it's about problem solving in ways that sort of, I've removed one option. I've removed the option, she can't be rescued by the hunter or the woodcutter. What are we going to do? Or rather, what is she going to do? And it's about those quality conversations, the dialogue we can have with children to lead them to critical responses to literature. And this is just a joy. This is a young child, and she's drawn a picture of Goldilocks, and this is how she tells the story around it. She's 3 years old. Goldilocks eated the 3 bears. Yuck! She spitted them out. They were dead, and someone killed Goldilocks, so they didn't live happily ever after. And the commentary there by Imre and Clements, that she's changing elements and exploring the tradition of good and bad. She's playing. She is playing with ideas. She is taking the threads of Goldilocks and she is twisting them together to create a new yarn, a new story. Apparently some of the other children couldn't cope with Isabella's story and left and didn't want to hear her tell her story because it was too unpleasant. But this is something to celebrate what Isabella is doing here, not to be concerned by it. The alternative ordering events, I've got one book on here and I wish I had more. So if you know of any more, please do send me a message and tell me. But previously works as it says it does. So Jack and Jill are falling down the hill previously, and it goes backwards in time. What happened before that? Goldilocks was in the house and broke the bed. Previously, what happened before that? And it works backwards. If you know the film Memento, which starts with the end and works back to the beginning, it's that idea. So it's playing with narrative, with the timeline, playing with narrative structure, taking the timeline of different stories and nursery rhymes in this case, untwisting them and then twisting them again to create this new backwards yarn, this backwards narrative. I've already said in the cinema we see stories which use elements from different folk tales, and I mentioned Into the Woods. What got me into interest in folk tales and then to storytelling was actually going to see Into the Woods when it was first on in London. And I bought the programme and read the programme notes in the interval. And in the interval, Stephen Sondheim talks about reading Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, which I've already mentioned. And on the way home, we went to an all-night bookshop and I bought it and I read it, like the next day. So the idea of mixing up fairy tales is a well-established tradition, and you can see different examples on here. And the mixed up fairy tales, if you don't know it, is open the flap book and you have different elements from fairy tales, and you can change which flaps you have so that you can have, I don't know, the wolf with a glass slipper, and a pea under the mattress. You could do all kinds of things with it. So children create their own narratives with that. Also, we have, which is separate really from the twisted fairy tales, but there is a connection here, texts that highlight specific features of folk and fairy tales that enable us to explore those things that get twisted up. So example, the fairy catalogue it's what it says. It's a catalogue, and it has, for example, different beds that you could buy depending on your purpose. So if you want a bed where you can feel a pea under the mattress, you need a particular kind of bed. If it's a bed where you're going to sleep for 100 years, it might be another kind of bed. So it's unpicking common tropes, common ideas that pop up again and again in folk and fairy tales. The map book explores the setting of stories and allows children to explore the whole of the setting of a folk tale or some literary tales as well. So the Wizard of Oz is in there. And then instructions is a series of, funnily enough, instructions on how to behave when you're in a story world. Now, these are different ways of using language. So far, we've been talking about story. Now, in story, we find other kinds of language. So in Little Red Riding Hood, we find, for instance, instructions, because Little Red Riding Hood's mother says, take this basket of food to your grandmother. Instructional language. We have explanations, where Little Red Riding Hood says to the wolf, well, I'm going to see my grandmother because she's very sick and I've got a basket of food. We also have persuasion. The wolf says to Little Red Riding Hood, well, why don't you pick some flowers for your grandmother? Look, the flowers are over there. Just pick some and then you'll make her very happy. So we see different kinds of non-narrative language within a narrative frame. What these kinds of books do is to unpick, to take out that non-narrative language and explore that. So we have what are non-narrative texts. I'm not going to call them non-fiction because they are fictional, but they are non-narrative. But they are non-narrative in relation to story worlds, into fairy tale and folktale worlds. We should fill our classrooms with resources to help children structure their own fairy tales and to tell their own stories and then write their own stories and interpret the stories that they are told and that they read for themselves. And I've just put a series of resources on here, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. The Hollow Woods is a beautiful, beautiful set of cards that can be placed in any order that create a journey through the woods where characters can encounter different, like a hollow tree or standing stones or particular characters. And those can be rearranged in any order, helping children to think about, well, what are the possibilities in fairy tales? You can see on the top left, we have got a play set for Hansel and Gretel. Now, the company who've made this have also done Snow White. They've made a set for Snow White, and you can see that this is a mixed race play set here. And then immediately below you have a Little Red Riding Hood of colour, so that as a toy to play out the story in early years Key Stage 1, it can be a character that looks like me for a child of colour. Then, of course, we have things like story dice and book bags like the one in the top right. To go back and review what I've been talking about, the idea of twisted fairy tales as versions of established folk or fairy tales, but that word established is culturally specific. It is what is established for that reader, that child, so that anything that varies from that will to them appear to be a twist on the tale. And the alternatives to those conventional elements for that cultural experience can be presented in relation to the setting, space and time, representations of characters and their cultures, and that may be things like switching gender, it may be different ethnic representations, the motivations of characters, because folk and fairy tales don't normally explore motivation. What they do is they explore action and character acting within a storied world to achieve a particular goal. We might look at alternative characters within the story that we're telling or reading, so that rather than telling the story of Cinderella, we tell the story of her stepmother. We might choose unexpected characters or add unexpected characters into a story that weren't there originally. So you might have, for example, in Little Red Riding Hood, you might have a health inspector turning up to the cottage to find a wolf in Granny's bed and being very concerned about animals on furniture. Power relationships between characters. We question the power relationships, particularly between things like the monster and the innocent. So the wolf and the pigs and those kind of the dragon and the princess, reversing those round, and also in relation to gender, male and female, who is the most powerful person in the story, and then finally the ordering of events. In addition to all of this, of course, we may take lots of different stories and take elements from them and twist them together. So we're taking out threads from different stories, twisting into a new yarn, into a new tale. Marina Warner said that children are not likely to be committed to a certain way of thought. They can be moulded, and the stories they hear will then be the ones they expect. And that goes back to my whole point about the cultural aspect of this is specific to the child themselves, to the culture within which they are situated. That may be the home culture, it may be the neighborhood culture, the geographical culture, it may be the school culture, it may be the national culture. But we need to pay attention to what the expectations are of the cultures that children bring with them, and what is expected of those, and what we can challenge and open them to, and how we can open the children to new experiences through these kind of twisted tales. This all ties in case you hadn't spotted, with critical literacy. And in my blog, I've summarised Johnson and Rogers in this way. And the references are on the end of the PowerPoint if you want to find, or the end of the video if you want to find where these things are. So we want children to ask how texts might be otherwise, because that's what the authors are doing when they present the three little wolves and the big bad pig. They're saying, well, how might it have been otherwise? So by helping children to think for themselves how it might be otherwise, they can challenge conventional and embedded texts. They can also examine what an author has done and what they have done to twist the tale. They can think about how to rewrite tales themselves and how authors have rewritten tales, and we can use role-playing in enacting stories to see what is possible, what we can do with stories. And by doing that, children are then able to involve their whole being in what they're doing, rather than the linguistic aspects of communication alone. By using role play, you're using non-verbal communication as well. So to expand the reader's social imaginations, as we're listening to different versions of Little Red Riding Hood, we might imagine why the author made particular choices. Why did 19th century authors expect Little Red Riding Hood to be waiting in a wolf's stomach and not do anything about it herself? We might question how someone else might fill the gaps in differently, because if we're writing from a different culture, then we may have all kinds of different expectations about how people behave, how people dress, what people eat, where they live, the kind of buildings they live in, and the kind of relationships, familiar relationships that they have. There's also what the author imagined that we would know or not know. Now, one of the things around fairy tales that is very common is the woodland setting, the forest setting. But how many children, I'm speaking from a UK context, how many children in the UK have that experience of going into a forest, of trees all around them, and being away from the sound of traffic in the 21st century? So the author makes all kinds of assumptions about what we're understanding here. How someone in a different time or place might think differently, which links to how someone else might fill in the gaps differently, and the perspective of someone not in the text, which we've already unpicked there. Finally, my favourite quote about story is from Jerome Bruner, that story is the coin and currency of culture. When we share a story with someone else, it is as if we are handing our coinage over and we are giving it to them to use. So you pay me in with coin in the days where we used money as opposed to a card, and then I paid someone else, and it passed on and round and round. That when we share stories with each other, we pass them on, and then they get passed on to someone else. So they are absolutely vital to how we understand and relate to the world around us, because we're going to use them to explain the world around us. And if you don't think that's true, I suggest you just watch some advertisements on commercial television and see how many times fairy tale tropes, fairy tale ideas just come up, just pop up again and again and again. I have a website, and as I said, I have a blog, www.storytent.co.uk, and you will find there a series of blog entries on different aspects of storytelling and narrative that may be helpful to you. I've got a couple of questions here for us as teachers, and I've linked them to Lorraine's text. So as I said, if you don't know it, go away and find it on YouTube, or even better, buy yourself a copy. And I've already talked about the fact it's got limited information in it. But given that limited information, what knowledge do you think the reader has to bring to that text for you to understand it? What assumptions is the writer, Lorraine, making about your knowledge of the world and about your knowledge of story and folktale that you are bringing to this text in order to understand what is going on and to be surprised by the ending? And then, what does that mean for the children with whom you work? Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has prompted some thinking for you. I'm perfectly happy to engage in discussion with people if you want to contact me, or maybe we'll meet up sometime and we can talk about fairy folktales and twisted tales. In the meantime, thank you very much and goodbye.